Welcome, this is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming. We do how-to videos about story and character development in Dungeons & Dragons. Today we're going to be talking about a brilliant yet somehow controversial DM, Matt Mercer, and what you would need to do to DM like him. Just to be absolutely clear, neither one of us is claiming to be his equal at DMing, which makes some of the sort of hate that's been directed at the man and his style of DMing even more puzzling. I think some people feel that he's not good for D&D because some players expect their DM to DM like him, and some DMs who don't necessarily have the same toolbox that he does will attempt to shoehorn their own DMing style to match his, which isn't the way to go. But if you want to DM like Matt Mercer, the first thing you need to do is become a talented voice actor. If you watch Critical Role and see how he runs his games, it's not just that he speaks in funny accents. The man is literally able to change his voice, his vocabulary, the cadence and speed with which he speaks. In order to DM like him, you would need to learn how to do this. If you're not able to do acting lessons, you could always record yourself doing these different voices and get good at it. But please just be aware that this isn't the kind of thing, and this is going to be a recurring theme to the video. This isn't something you're going to watch one episode of Critical Role and automatically be able to do.
Oh yes, and I just love to add to that as someone who is dealing with some voice coaching in personal matters, I can say that it is extremely difficult. It takes months to make any kind of progress on that, so again, just really keep in mind that this isn't going to be an overnight thing. You're not going to be able to just change your whole voice overnight. So, but that also sort of goes into the next focus, which is also, if you're going to be talking for long lengths of time, what was the last game that you ever had where your players actually allowed you to finish a sentence before asking a question? Let's just be honest here. And even as DMs...
Do I need to roll a perception check, or is it a history check for me to remember when the last game was that happened?
That would be a perception check, and that is exactly what we were talking about there. But, yes, that's exactly what we were talking about, actually, to a T, is if I'm going to be describing the world of, I don't know, a Mestria from Full Metal Alchemist, that's a good 5 to 10 minute explanation if you're going to try and copy Matt Mercer, is that world has a lot in it. And it's the only one I could think of off the top of my head as developed as some of the stuff he does. So you really need to have players who will sit down and not go, oh, can I add to my backstory then that blank is in blank? You really have to be able to, you have to make sure your party members will not interrupt you, and you have to be able to go for long lengths of time. So.
And when you do this, anybody who's DM knows that when you go into narrating a scene or doing a funny voice, sometimes your players give you funny looks, sometimes your players giggle. It takes a lot of practice and poise in order to be able to sort of stay in character while that's going on. You see it all the time in blooper reels with famous movies and so forth. Actors crack up. And that's even trained paid actors do that. So it takes a certain practice and talent to be able to do that. Now, one of the things you need to do to get there is do the level of preparation that he clearly does. If you watch any episode of Critical Role, I don't know how much of what the players do is planned or scripted ahead of time, and I don't care to speculate, but it's very clear that he has his descriptions and his settings mapped out to a T well ahead of time. One of the things that's very telling about his sessions, the ones I've seen at least, is they don't use a battle map, but he seems to have a sense of how far everything is away from everything else and the dimensions of every space they're in. So it's not just a question of writing out your monologues, it's a question of writing out the situations you're in to where you can tell the player right off the top of your head where they are in relation to something else and what they can do.
Yes. Now, I do want to say something in response to that as well, which is also just, you have to consider that if you're everything planned out to that extent, you also have to have the just force of will to really be able to keep things on track and going forward. I think that that's really, while I'm no Matt Mercer by any means, I think that that is where I truly stepped up my DMing for the first time, is when I was DMing a campaign with Ben and some friends, and they were all talking for a bit, discussing what their plan was, and eventually I just said, right, this is happening. And you see, Matt Mercer does that to an extent which I do not even do. I only do that occasionally when absolutely necessary, whereas he's like, okay, we're going. So you have to really be able to power through, and you have to be able to accept that not all of your players might like the fact that you're powering through their 3.5 hour planning session. So,
which brings us to step 5. If what we're talking about sounds a little bit like railroading your players, yeah, that's what he's doing. Because in order to have all of these pre-prepared settings, characters, and situations just ready to go, you have to have your players be at least marginally going along with what you're planning to do. If a player veers off into a random side quest, they just decide to take a fascination with an NPC that you had not even planned on them talking to,
which will happen,
absolutely you can do some improvisation. That can happen, but it's not going to be as clean, it's not going to be as crisp, it's not going to just have that perfected look that you get out of Mercer's world. So you have to have a party that is somewhat ready to be railroaded, even to the point of having you decide what some of their spells and abilities are going to be.
Yes, that actually is one of the last points, is that with Matt Mercer's campaigns especially, he predetermines what the spell lists are, and to some extent, and he doesn't strictly predetermine what everyone's classes are going to be, but he definitely knows beforehand and influences their decisions. But again, I'm not saying that he knows what the spell list is. No, I am saying that he has gone through and chosen what the best spell list is for each of the characters in the game. That is how you have to behave as a DM with this, is you have to be in absolute control of every part of this world.
The one thing I will say that I would recommend to any DM, whether you're trying to do Mercer or not, one thing he clearly does is he has their spell lists at his fingertips. I actually really like that, and that's something I'm going to at least try to start incorporating when I DM, because I've seen it on Critical Role where the player doesn't seem to quite know what their spell does, and he looks at something that's on his table. It's very clear that he has the spell in front of him. So you don't get into that situation where you have the player saying, I want to cast such and such, but then they don't know what the damage roll is, or the area, or the range, or whatever it is. That comes up a lot, especially with newer players, but sometimes with older ones. It's probably the most boring part of this whole delve into what makes for that particular style of DMing, but it's also quite possibly the most universally usable.
Well, yes, and if you don't have the DMing wherewithal to do this, because that is understandable, if you're going to do a lot of these other steps, you might just not have the mind or the patience to keep track of specific spells. Something that I've actually done as a player, which you can talk about in your session 0, is a good example is I was in the campaign a while back in one of Ben's campaigns, and I cast Wall of Sand. Now, I had a vague idea of what this did, and I knew how it worked, but I didn't know the exact damage dice, and I wanted to keep things moving. And so, knowing that most of the wall spells do something like 3 to 4d6 damage, I just looked at the book for a second and said, alright, does 3d6 damage, because I wanted to keep things moving, and I underpowered it a bit from what it is. So that's something else, is even when Matt Mercer doesn't know what he's doing, he does improvise very, very well and very cleanly, and it's also on the players to do that as well if they're in a campaign in a Matt Mercer-esque style.
Yes, that's something I come back to a lot in DMing, and other great channels, other great D&D channels, such as Taking 20, do reference it. players don't know what's going on behind the screen. Sometimes you can fudge things. Sometimes you can make it work to your needs. But once again, you have to have your party, every single player, being willing to go along with the fact that you're choosing what their characters are, what spell slots are going to work for this campaign, and not throw it off. So you have to have total agreement from each of your players in terms of this is how the campaign is going to run. So, our 7 steps to DM like Matt Mercer. 1, become a talented voice actor. 2, have your party go along with and be quiet during your long narrations. 3, put in an insane level of preparation into not every campaign, every session, so you can describe every room that the party is going to be in and be prepared with a pre-prepared narration and character for each of those situations. 4, have the strict force of will to keep to it, to not get sidetracked, to not veer off. 5, talk the party into agreeing to a campaign that's going to be almost a complete railroad. 6, do your players' work for them and tailor their spell and abilities lists. And 7, have the party go along with that, along with everything else. If this sounds like an insane amount of work to you, it might be because it's not your style. It's not the most practical style of DMing. Sometimes it's just fun to, you're in a village, a bunch of goblins are attacking, roll initiative, and whatever happens, happens.
Yes, now, the thing to remember here is the fact that not everything that you do is going to be like Matt Mercer, even if you follow all of these steps. And it's important to remember that you do you better than you do Matt Mercer, as Ben has actually said to me before. But that also brings me to sort of the finishing piece de la resistance of this video, which is that it's important to remember that while Matt Mercer is not bad for D&D, he's also not the end-all DM of D&D. He is not the Jesus of D&D. You know, he does not determine what the perfect meta is. So,
absolutely. Now, as always, we thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing to our channel to see more content. Give us your thoughts. What do you think about Matt Mercer? What do you think makes a great DM? What are your favorite tips and tricks for any DMs who might be looking to step up their game, or any players who might be getting into DMing for the first time? Next time, we're going to be talking about how to play Tabaxi. We hope to see you on that one. Thank you again.